before the first name is ever spoken, before a single generation is traced, there is a quiet truth hidden in the pages of Scripture. God has always been telling one long, broken story. A story written not in perfection, but in patience. Not in flawless heroes, but in fragile human lives. To many modern readers, genealogies may seem like endless lists of unfamiliar names, easy to skim and forget. Yet, to the people of ancient Israel, these names were sacred threads, weaving together identity, history, and promise. Each name whispered a reminder that God had not abandoned his covenant, that his word had not failed, that his plan was still unfolding even when human hearts stumbled. Tabanja, when Matthew opened his gospel with the genealogy of Jesus, he was doing more than recording ancestry. He was declaring that every promise God had ever made was now converging in one life. This was not merely a family tree, it was a map of redemption. And hidden within its branches were stories so unexpected, so uncomfortable, so astonishing, that they demanded attention. Chained among the long line of fathers and sons, 5 women appeared. Not quietly, not accidentally. They stood out like lights in the darkness. In a world where genealogies rarely mentioned women, where heritage passed through men, their presence was deliberate. It was as if God himself had underlined their names and said, "Look closer. This is how I work." And these women were not queens surrounded by luxury. They were not priestesses honored by crowds. They were outsiders, widows, foreigners, victims, and young girls from forgotten towns. Some carried painful pasts. Some bore heavy shame. Some lived in vulnerability and uncertainty. Yet God chose them, not despite their stories, but through them. And their lives declared something radical. God's kingdom is not built on human approval. It is built on grace. And long before Bethlehem, long before angels and shepherds, there was Tamar. Her story unfolded quietly in a broken household. She entered Judah's family as a young bride, hopeful, trusting, expecting a future. But her husband died before that future could take shape. According to custom, she should have been given another son to marry, so that her husband's name would live on. That was the law, that was justice, that was protection, but justice was denied to her. She married again. He died too. Now she was twice widowed, twice abandoned, twice vulnerable. Judah, instead of protecting her, feared her. Instead of honoring his promise, he sent her away. He left her waiting in her father's house with empty hands and fading hope. Years passed. Promises were forgotten. Her life was placed on pause by someone else's cowardice. Yet Tamar refused to disappear. And she understood the system that had failed her. She knew her rights. She knew what had been stolen. And in a moment of bold resolve, she acted. Disguised and unrecognized, she confronted Judah. Without words, she held his own identity in her hands. And when the truth was revealed, the powerful man who had wronged her had no defense. "And she is more righteous than I am," those words echoed through generations. Tamar did not seek scandal. She sought justice. And God honored her courage. From her came Perez, and from Perez would flow the line that led to David and to Christ. God had written redemption into her pain. Then came Rahab. She lived in Jericho, behind thick walls and fragile dreams. She was known for her profession, known for her past, known for her shame. In the eyes of society, she was already condemned, but she had been listening. She had heard of seas opening, of slaves becoming free, of enemies falling, of a God unlike any other. And somewhere in her heart, faith was born, not from miracles she saw, but from truth she believed. When spies entered her city, she faced a choice: loyalty to her people, or faith in a God she had never seen. She chose God. She hid the spies. She risked her life. She spoke words of belief that sounded like worship. "Your God is God in heaven and on earth. You know, and she tied a red cord in her window. When the walls collapsed, her house still stood. Jane's, when her city fell, her family lived. From prostitute to protector, from outsider to ancestor, from condemned to chosen. Dan Grace had found her. Then there was Ruth. She had known loss early. She buried her husband in a foreign land. She watched her mother-in-law collapse under grief. She stood at a crossroads where logic told her to turn back, to start over, to save herself. Temptation, but love told her to stay. Where you go, I will go. With those words, she abandoned comfort for commitment. She traded security. She walked into a land where she would be judged for her accent, her origin, her blood. And she worked. Quietly, humbly, faithfully, she gathered leftover grain under the sun, never knowing she was gathering her future. God watched every step, every act of loyalty, every tear, and he was weaving blessing into her obedience. Boaz noticed her. Redemption followed. A child was born. Naomi's emptiness turned into joy. And Ruth, the foreign widow, became the great-grandmother of kings. Next came Bathsheba. Her story is heavy. It carries shadows. It reminds us that power can wound and silence can hide pain. She was seen. Taken. Used. A king abused his authority. A woman bore the consequences: pregnancy, loss, grief, death, mourning. Muller. Her life was reshaped by someone else's sin. Yet, God did not abandon her in the wreckage. He confronted injustice. He brought repentance. He restored dignity. From her came Solomon. From her came wisdom. And from her came legacy. Her story teaches us that God redeems even what others destroy. And then, finally, came Mary. No scandal in her past, no tragic reputation, no broken marriage, just obscurity, a teenage girl in a forgotten village, unknown, uncelebrated, unimportant in the world's eyes until heaven called her name, an angel spoke, a destiny was revealed, a miracle was promised, and she said yes, not knowing the whispers, not knowing the rejection, not knowing the pain. Not knowing the cross, she trusted anyway. She carried God's Son in her womb. Mangziab. She carried sorrow in her heart. She carried hope into history. She stood at the manger. Man, she stood at the cross. She stood in faith. Man, through Tamar's courage, Rahab's faith, Ruth's loyalty, Bathsheba's endurance, and Mary's surrender, God revealed his pattern. And he works through broken people. He builds through unlikely lives. He redeems through surrendered hearts. This genealogy is not about perfection. It is about grace. It is about how God takes forgotten names and turns them into eternal witnesses. It is about how no story is too damaged, no past too dark, no life too small. No, and as these stories unfold, as their lives weave together across centuries, they begin to point us toward something even greater. Because behind every name, behind every struggle, behind every act of faith, God was preparing the world for the arrival of his Son, long before shepherds watched their flocks beneath silent skies, long before wise men began their distant journey, long before a child's cry would echo through a stable in Bethlehem. God had been arranging moments, shaping hearts, and guiding lives that seemed ordinary, broken, or forgotten. Tambliant. Every generation carried both promise and pain. Every family carried both faith and failure. And yet, none of it was wasted. Bent from Tamar's courage to Rahab's faith, from Ruth's loyalty to Bathsheba's endurance, from Mary's surrender to Joseph's obedience, God was showing the world that salvation would not come through flawless bloodlines, power, or religious prestige. It would come through surrendered hearts. Jesus did not step into a perfect family. He stepped into a real one. A family marked by scandal and sacrifice. by tears and triumph, by weakness and worship, and that was no accident. Because he did not come for perfect people. He came for people like them and like us. When Jesus was finally born in Bethlehem, wrapped in cloth and laid in a feeding trough, heaven celebrated what earth. Angels sang, shepherds ran, stars guided. Yet to most of the world nothing had changed. Yet to most of the world nothing had changed. Another child, another poor family, another forgotten night, but history had shifted. All the names in that genealogy, every story, every struggle, every waiting season, had been pointing to this moment. God had kept his word, the promises given to Abraham, the covenant renewed through David, the hope whispered by prophets. The mercy shown through broken lives, all of it had led here. And in that humble, stable grace, took on flesh. The same God who worked through widows, foreigners, victims, and teenagers now stepped into their world as one of them. He entered human weakness. He embraced human suffering. He chose poverty over privilege, humility over honor, service over status. And he carried with him the stories of those women. Tamar's fight for justice, Rahab's courageous faith, Ruth's sacrificial love, Bathsheba's quiet resilience, Mary's fearless obedience. Their stories lived on in him. And in his compassion for the outcast, in his defense of the accused, in his welcome of sinners, in his love for the forgotten. When Jesus spoke to a Samaritan woman at a well, he was echoing Ruth. And when he forgave a woman caught in sin, he was honoring Bathsheba. When he praised bold faith, he was remembering Rahab. When he confronted hypocrisy, he was standing with Tamar. When he surrendered to the Father's will in Gethsemane, he was reflecting Mary. Nothing in the genealogy was random. It was preparation. It was prophecy in human form. It was God saying, "This is who my kingdom is for." Not for the flawless, but for the faithful. Not for the proud, but for the humble. Not for those who think they are worthy, but for those who know they need grace. And then came the cross, the place where all their stories reached their deepest meaning. Just as Tamar faced injustice, Jesus endured false judgment. Just as Rahab risked her life, Jesus gave his. Just as Ruth left everything behind, Jesus left heaven. Just as Bathsheba knew sorrow, Jesus bore grief. Just as Mary stood in surrender, Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but yours." On that hill outside Jerusalem, the Son of God carried every broken story in that genealogy, and every broken story that would ever come after. He carried yours. He carried mine. And when he cried, "It is finished," he was not just ending his suffering. He was completing their story. He was sealing God's promise. As he was opening the door for every Tamar, every Rahab, every Ruth, every wounded heart, every overlooked soul, every searching spirit. The resurrection proved that none of it had been in vain. Pain had not won. Sin had not won. That death had not won. Grace had. And now the genealogy continues, not on parchment, not in ancient scrolls, but in living hearts, because everyone who believes becomes part of God's family. Every person who trusts becomes a child of promise. Every life surrendered becomes another chapter in his story. You may feel like Tamar, wronged and forgotten. You may feel like Rahab, ashamed and unworthy. You may feel like Ruth, lonely and uncertain. You may feel like Bathsheba, wounded by someone else's choices. You may feel like Mary, small and overwhelmed by God's calling. But the same God who wrote their stories is still writing today. He is still redeeming, still restoring, and still choosing the unlikely, still bringing beauty from brokenness. And just as he wove their lives into the story of salvation, he is weaving yours into something greater than you can see. Hongdi, because this story is not over yet, because God has never finished writing when people think the page is full. And every generation that followed Jesus had a choice. Some would hear his name and walk away. Some would hear his words and be changed forever. Some would cling to religion, others would cling to grace. But those who truly followed him discovered something extraordinary, that the same God who worked through Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary was now working through fishermen, tax collectors, former zealots, broken women, doubting men, and fearful disciples. Peter denied him. Thomas doubted him. Paul persecuted his followers. Mary Magdalene carried a past no one could erase. Yet Jesus called them, restored them, trusted them, and sent them. Once again, God was building his kingdom through imperfect people. The early church did not grow because it was powerful. It grew because it was surrendered. Because ordinary men and women carried an extraordinary message into hostile cities, dangerous nations, and unbelieving hearts. They carried the story of a Savior who had entered their pain and conquered their fear. They remembered the genealogy, Talmia. They knew where he came from. They knew what kind of people God had always used. And that gave them courage. When they were imprisoned, they remembered Rahab. When they were rejected, they remembered Ruth. But when they were misunderstood, they remembered Mary. When they were treated unjustly, they remembered Tamar. When they were broken by loss, they remembered Bathsheba. And they kept going, through persecution and poverty, through exile and execution, through ridicule and resistance. The story moved forward. Empires rose and fell. Kingdoms collapsed, languages changed, cultures shifted, but grace remained. Centuries passed, generations were born and buried. Yet the same message echoed. God saves, God restores. God redeems, and now, here you are, reading this, listening to this. Hearing their stories and sensing something stirring inside your heart. That is not coincidence. That is invitation. Because somewhere along your journey, God has been working quietly through disappointments, delays, closed doors, unanswered prayers, and unexpected blessings, shaping you for something you may not yet understand. You may look at your life and see only fragments, mistakes, missed chances, broken relationships, unfulfilled dreams, silent struggles, hidden fears. But God sees a story. He sees purpose where you see pain. He sees calling where you see confusion. He sees growth where you see failure. Just as Tamar could not see Perez's future, just as Rahab could not imagine David's throne, just as Ruth could not foresee Bethlehem's manger, just as Bathsheba could not envision Solomon's temple, just as Mary could not comprehend resurrection morning, you cannot yet see what God is building through you. But he can, and he is faithful. Sometimes God writes his greatest chapters in seasons of waiting. Sometimes he shapes his strongest servants in hidden places. Sometimes he prepares his biggest blessings through the longest trials. And always, he is closer than you think. The genealogy of Jesus teaches us that God does not erase our past. He redeems it, cleaned. He does not ignore our wounds. He heals them. He does not discard our failures. He transforms them. He weaves them into testimony. One day, when you look back, you may realize that what once felt like abandonment was actually preparation. What felt like delay was protection. What felt like loss was redirection. What felt like silence was shaping your faith. And in that moment, you will understand, you were never forgotten. You were never overlooked. You were never insignificant. Galend, you were being written into something eternal, because God is still building his family, still gathering his sons and daughters. Man still calling the broken home, still lifting the humble, still forgiving the repentant, still strengthening the weak. Dan still restoring the lost, and your name, your story, your journey matters more than you know. Balnian, just as those 5 women once stood quietly in a list of names that many overlooked, you may feel unnoticed in a world that rushes past your pain and struggles. But heaven sees you, God knows you, God is working in you and through you. Banjer. So when doubt whispers that your life is too messy, when shame tells you that your past is too heavy, and when fear says your future is too uncertain, remember Tamar, remember Rahab, remember Ruth, remember Bathsheba, remember Mary. And remember this, the God who turned their stories into salvation history is still turning lives into testimonies. Mendier, and he is not finished with yours yet. Because the story of God has never been confined to ink and parchment, to ancient names and distant generations. It breathes, it moves, it unfolds in real time, in real lives, in quiet prayers whispered at midnight, and silent tears shed when no one is watching. It unfolds in hospital rooms and empty houses, in classrooms and crowded streets, in broken marriages and new beginnings, in failures that feel final and hopes that refuse to die. Every day God is still writing, and most of the time he writes in ways we do not recognize. We expect thunder. He sends whispers. Jans, we look for miracles. He gives endurance. We ask for answers. He offers his presence. The women in Jesus' genealogy did not wake up one morning knowing they were part of history. Tamar did not know her courage would echo for centuries. Rahab did not realize her faith would reshape her destiny. Ruth had no idea her loyalty would lead to kings. Bathsheba could not see past her grief. Mary did not fully understand the weight of her yes. They simply trusted God, one step at a time. And that is how faith has always worked, not through perfect understanding, but through daily surrender, not through complete clarity, Banjan, but through continued obedience, not through fearlessness, but through courage in the presence of fear. There are seasons when God asks you to walk without seeing the road ahead, to forgive when you still hurt, Dan, to believe when circumstances contradict his promises, to obey when it costs you comfort, and to wait when everything in you wants to run. Those are the seasons when legacies are formed. Those are the moments when heaven leans close. Those are the chapters that later become testimonies. Shindras, you may feel right now like your life is paused, like nothing is happening, like your prayers are unanswered. Damned you, like your efforts are unnoticed, like your faith is fragile. But so did they. Tamar waited, Rahab waited, Ruth waited, Bathsheba waited, Mary waited. Waiting is not wasted in God's hands. It is preparation. It is refinement. It is strengthening. It is shaping your character for what is coming. Sometimes God delays the blessing because he is developing the vessel. Sometimes he withholds the promise because he is growing the person. Sometimes he closes doors because he is protecting your future. And sometimes he allows pain because he is teaching you to lean on him instead of yourself. The genealogy of Jesus reminds us that God is patient. He works across centuries. He is never rushed. He is never late. What feels slow to you is precise to him. What feels confusing to you is purposeful to him. What feels broken to you is redeemable to him. And just as he connected Tamar to Rahab, Rahab to Ruth, Ruth to Bath, Sheba, Bath, Sheba, to Mary, Mary, to Christ, Bleed. He is connecting your past to your future in ways you cannot yet see. Your failures are not the end. Omnit, your mistakes are not the conclusion. Your pain is not the final chapter. They are paragraphs in a larger story. Giendi, a story of grace, a story of redemption, a story of restoration, a story that leads to Christ. And through Christ leads to life. To one day, you may sit in quiet reflection and realize that the moments you once wanted to erase were the moments God used most powerfully. Mons, the rejection that drove you closer to Him, the disappointment that taught you dependence, the loss that deepened your compassion. Blend, the struggle that strengthened your faith, the waiting that refined your character, and you will understand that nothing was wasted. Not one tear, not one prayer, not one lonely night, not one silent battle, not one broken dream. But God saw them all, He collected them all, He used them all, and He is still using them right now. In this moment, in your life, you are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not disqualified. You are not invisible. You are exactly where God can work, exactly where grace can flow, exactly where faith can grow, exactly where purpose can emerge. The same God who entered history through a genealogy, wants to enter your story through surrender. The same God who transformed broken women into pillars of redemption wants to transform broken hearts into testimonies. The same God who brought light out of darkness wants to shine through you. So do not give up. Do not grow weary. Do not let shame define you. Do not let fear silence you. Do not let disappointment harden you. Lift your eyes. Open your heart. Trust His hand, because somewhere beyond what you can see, God is preparing another chapter. And it will be more beautiful than you ever imagined.